One of the biggest concerns that us system administrators have in today's networked world is security. Users, on the other hand, most of them, they couldn't care less about security. They just want access to their data, plain and simple. They want access to their data, to their applications, to their email, from anywhere, and it doesn't matter whether they're at home, they just want access. So whether your users are sitting at their desk in the office, or they're at their dinner table at home, or maybe they're in neither of those places. Maybe you have traveling users that are overseas, in some hotel room on their notebook, or even on a remote beach in Whoopsville. Really though, your users don't care about security as a general rule because, well, that's your job. The problem is that this sort of freedom of access to the corporate network and the level of security that you, the administrator, strives for, they're two vastly different things, and in years gone by, these things didn't go hand in hand. Well, that was until the introduction of virtual private networks, or VPNs. VPNs are what allow users to connect from a remote network, such as a laptop in a hotel room or their computer at home, to connect over a public network, such as the internet, to your corporate network, all in a secure and controlled manner. Okay, so in our diagram here, we've got a couple of remote computers. We've got a remote laptop here and a remote PDA or smartphone, some sort of other device. And we could be using these devices sitting at home, connected via broadband or Wi-Fi. And it really doesn't matter. We could be on the other side of the world in the middle of a rainforest, just as long as we have some sort of connection to the internet. We're going to be able to connect to our corporate network. So our connection from these devices, of course, is going to take place over the internet. The connection will then go through our corporate firewall, hitting our VPN server here, and it's our VPN server that's going to take the responsibility for authenticating our connection, and then we'll be able to access things on the inside of our corporate network, just as if we were sitting at our corporate desk. And this is the sort of stuff that VPNs are used for. Corporations want their users to be able to access the corporate network when they're away on business trips, or maybe they just need to work from home. Now, us administrators, we often need to connect to the network from home as well to offer support or even to perform outside of hours style maintenance. So let's see how we can set up a VPN to allow these outside connections to our corporate network. Okay, well, here I am on our Windows 2008 server, which in a moment will become our VPN server. Now, the only real area that this machine is going to differ from any other Windows 2008 server that we've used in most of our videos is that this one has two network cards, and let's go and open up networking on this machine. And we'll go to our network connections here. All right, well, in this window, you can see that we've got two cards. We've got one network card that's going to connect to our internal network and another that's going to connect to our external network. Now, the reason we're here at this network connections folder is not just really to take a look at these cards, because there is something that I'd recommend that we do first before we get started. Now, this is an entirely optional step, by the way, because it is only something that's purely cosmetic. So I'd recommend that we rename these connections first. That way we can identify which connection is internal and which one's external. So let's do that now. So I'm just going to hit F2, and that's going to enable me to rename this. I'm going to call this one internal, if I could spell internal. And our other one we're going to call, funnily enough, external. All right, so we've got our two network interfaces, this one here pointing to our internal network, and obviously this one pointing outside to our external internet. In fact, rather than calling it external, I'm going to call this one internet. There we go. That's probably a little easier. Again, now that is a purely optional step. You don't have to rename your connections there. I like to do it because when I'm in the VPN console, it's nice to be able to easily identify which connection is doing what. All right, well, we can go ahead and we can close these windows now. We really don't need them. And we're going to go ahead and create our VPN server. So in order to create a VPN, the first step is to install the remote access role. So we're going to open up Server Manager. We're going to click Roles. And over here, we're going to click Add Roles. That starts our wizard. We'll click Next. Now we'll need to add in the network policy and Access Services role. So let's click that, and that's going to cover a few different scenarios, and of course VPNs is one of them. So we'll click Next. We'll get some information here about network policy and access services. We can read that later if we like. We'll click Next. Okay, well here we've got our role services window, and what we're going to select is the remote access service, because this role service is what's going to provide us with the ability to create our VPNs. That's all we need to select. These other things here, we don't need those in this video. We'll click Next. And we're done. We'll click Install. Now obviously this is going to take a few moments to install, so I'm going to pause the video here and we'll be back once this is done. Alright, well we're back. Our installation was complete and you can see that it also was successful. So let's click Close. Alright, now we'll go click Start, Administrative Tools, and we're going to launch the Routing and Remote Access console here. And immediately you're going to notice over here on the left hand side that our server called S14 has this downward pointing red arrow. And when we select this, it's going to tell us here that we will still need to configure the routing and remote access server because our server isn't yet fully functioning. There is some more configuration we'll need to do in order to get this machine running as a VPN server. So the next step is to right click on our server over on the left here, choose the top option, configure and enable routing and remote access. And this is going to start up a new wizard here, the routing and remote access server setup wizard. Let's click Next. Alright, well you're going to notice here on this initial screen that we've got a few different options to choose from. And in this video, we're really only interested in the top one. That's to configure remote access for dial-up or VPN connections. Now, dial-up connections really aren't used that much anymore, but in some places where broadband isn't available, like remote rural properties, it's still possible that dial-up would be an option. Now, you'll also note that we can configure NAT, network address translation. We can do VPNs and NAT, or connections between two different networks, but all of these are topics for other videos. So we're going to go with the first option, remote access for dial-up or VPN, and we'll click Next. Alright, so what's it going to be? Remote access using a VPN or a dial-up connection, or both? Well, there's no prizes for guessing that VPN is going to be the correct choice for this video. We'll select that. We'll click Next. Alright, now here we're going to need to select which network interface in this server is connected to the internet, and you can see that listed up here. Which one is connected to the internet? So right now you probably realize why I like to rename these interfaces and why we did it a moment ago. So which one is connected to the internet? Well, the one that I called internet, of course. Obviously we're going to select that. Alright, now down the bottom here I'm going to uncheck this box from my lab because it's not really required, although for a production environment where security is a concern, you'll most likely want to leave this box checked to set up packet filters on this interface to only allow VPN traffic through this interface. Again, for my lab, that's unnecessary. We'll uncheck that, click Next. Now here we'll need to configure how we plan on assigning IP addresses to the clients that connect to our network using remote access. We could choose to automatically do that by using a DHCP server, if we have one, of course. But if we don't have a DHCP server and we'd still like to have our automatic IP address assignment occur, then our remote access server, this server, will be able to generate those addresses. Now, alternatively, we can specify a range of IP addresses if we like. Now, I'm going to go with the default here and have automatically assigned IP addresses because I do have a DHCP server available on my network, and that's almost a certainty that you guys listening to this video are going to have a DHCP server handy as well. In fact, I've just switched over to my domain controller here and into our DHCP server console. And you'll notice that over here, I've configured a small scope, and you can see that this scope here has around, what have we got, 30 IP addresses that we can use from 0.120 to 0.150. And currently, if we select address leases, you'll also see that this is empty. Currently, none of those 30 IP addresses are in use, and we are going to see this change later on when our remote access server is up and running. So I wanted to quickly point out ahead of time that we do have this range of IP addresses, this scope that we've got available. We've got 30 IP addresses that we can use, but right at this moment, nothing's taking those IP addresses. Okay, well, I've just switched back to our wizard, our setup wizard for the routing and remote access server. And probably one thing I should point out now, just in case you're confused by this screen, and you might be thinking, well, why do I need to get an IP address anyway? Won't my users already have one? Good question. Well, yes, they do. You see, regardless of how the remote client is connected to the internet, whether they've got a dial-up modem or a broadband account at home, maybe they're at a remote corporate office or a customer site, or even a hotel room using the hotel's Wi-Fi internet connection. In any of those scenarios, the remote user will already have an IP address that they'll be using to connect to the internet. Now, when a user needs to connect here to our corporate network, though, they're going to get another totally separate IP address for use just with our remote session. And that's something we'll see a little later on in this video. So we're going to leave the default here. We'll click Next. All right, now, do we want to use a radius server? So this is asking if we want this machine to forward authentication requests to a network policy server. Now, the answer here for this video is going to be no. We're not going to set this up. But this is something that we want to cover in a later video, in our network policies video. So for now, we're going to say no. We'll click Next. And we're done, so we'll click Finish. And now that we're done, we'll get a message here telling us that in order to support relaying of DHCP messages from our remote access clients, we'll need to configure the DHCP relay agent. Well, actually, we won't, because that'll be done automatically. We'll click OK, and our services will be started up. Great. Well, now that our server has been started, if we come up here and expand this, and we click on Ports, you're going to see a whole bunch of different ports for use with SSTP, and let's just scroll down, we'll see them for PPTP, and a little bit further down we should see them for L2TP. In fact, there's 128 ports for each type there. So right out of the box, this server is able to support 128 simultaneous connections of any of these three types. Now, if that's not enough connections for you, or more likely, if that's too many simultaneous connections for your internet link to support, then we can right-click on Ports and choose Properties. And in here, you can see the different configuration or connection rather types that we have, PPTP, L2TP, and SSTP, and each of them supporting 128 connections. So to change any of these, we'll just select it from the list. We'll choose the Configure button, and then we can set the number of ports. Let's change this to, say, 50. And let's click OK. We'll get a message here telling us that if this number that we're setting of 50 is less than the amount of active connections that we've got on our server right now, then some of our users might be disconnected, which is, well, probably pretty logical. That's fine. Obviously, at the moment, I don't have any connections because this is a new server, so I'm going to say yes, and we'll make that change permanent. And there you can see that change has now been applied. And if by some chance that you're confused at this point as to what PPTP, L2TP, and SSTP are, don't worry about that. We're going to get around to that in a moment when we actually configure our VPN. But before we do that, though, I'm going to quickly just switch back to our DHCP server, because now that we do have our remote access server running, some interesting changes are afoot with our DHCP server. Now I've just switched back to our DHCP server, so let's go and refresh our console. And straight away, you can see now we've got 10 leases that have been taken by our remote access server here, S14. And over here on the right-hand side, you can see that they've been taken by RAS, the remote access server. So what's happened is our remote access server, it needs to be handing out IP addresses to clients that connect to it. Now our DHCP server here isn't going to be directly talking with our remote clients. Instead, the remote client is going to hit our remote access server or our VPN server, and it will be handing them out an IP address. So you might be asking, well, where does our remote access server get its IP addresses from? This DHCP server, of course. It's going to contact the DHCP server, and it's going to ask the DHCP server for IP addresses 10 at a time it's going to hang on to those IP addresses and hand them out as it needs to. And then it's going to come back and ask for 10 more as it requires them. And that's why you can see that all of these 10 IP addresses here are all assigned to the remote access server and not any connecting clients. In fact, we actually don't even have any remote access clients yet, but the remote access server is ready for connections because it's got this list of 120 down to 129 that it's able to hand out to remote clients at a moment's notice. Now, even though this video obviously isn't intended to be a tutorial on how to use and configure DHCP because that's the topic of a different video, I will point out something new in DHCP for Windows 2008. If we go and right-click on Scope Options, in fact, let's select it first, then right-click and choose Configure Options, and then come to the Advanced tab. Now here under our User Class drop-down box, you can set the default routing and remote access class. So that now means that you're able to set any of these options here in the window below and have them automatically passed over to the clients that are connecting remotely. That also means that any regular desktop user inside the corporate network that's using DHCP, they're not going to receive these options. Only remote users connecting through the routing and remote access service will get them. So that's quite a nice feature there in Windows 2008. Now back on our remote access server, the next thing I want to talk about is the authentication methods that are available to our remote access server. So to configure these, we'll come back here and select our server. We're going to right click and choose Properties. Then we'll choose the Security tab. And finally, the Authentication Methods button. Now in here, you'll notice that we've got 4 different authentication methods. We've got EAP, Mschap version 2, Chap version 1, and PAP. And you'll also note that down the bottom we really do have a 5th method, which is to not use any authentication at all. Well, let me tell you right away that the bottom option here, using no authentication, and using PAP, which is just a plain text password, both of these are real bad. I really couldn't suggest any real reason nowadays to be using either of these two. Now, Chap, obviously working our way from bottom to top, is also a pretty old authentication method now. It's been around for years and years, and it's not one of the very reliable authentication methods because it's certainly been cracked by now. Now, Mschap version 2 is a pretty good encryption method, and to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been cracked, even though it has been around for a while now. And you'll find there's a lot of software out there that supports Mschap version 2, so it's definitely a worthwhile choice. Now at the top we have EAP, Extensible Authentication Protocol, which is what we'll use if we are using Network Access Protection, or NAP, which requires us to have a network policy server as well, something we're going to talk about in another video. Alright, well let's move on and let's try out our VPN now, because we're ready to go here. Our server's all fired up and it's awaiting some connections. So I've just quickly switched over to a Windows Vista client machine in our network here, so let's go and try out connecting to our VPN server. So down here in our system notification area, I'm going to right click on our network icon here and choose Network and Sharing Center. And over here on the left hand side, I'm going to choose to set up a connection or a network. Now, right at the bottom of this window here, you'll see that we've got an option to connect to a workplace, which allows us to establish a dial-up or VPN connection. So obviously that's the option we want there, the keyword VPN. We'll select that and click Next. All right, now what is it that we want to create? Do we want to create a VPN connection or a dial-up connection? Obviously it's VPN that we want. We're going to choose the top option here. Okay, now here's where we'll need to enter in the details of our VPN server. Now that can either be a fully qualified domain name, something like vpn.jorkus.com, that would work. Or it could be an IP address, say 10.64.0.41. Now just remember, this is the external or the internet network card that we want to point to here. The network card on the remote access server, our VPN server, that obviously points to the internet. Now, we can also give this VPN connection a name, and you can see that that does default to VPN connection. And that's obviously fine if you're only ever going to have one VPN connection, but if you have several, you'll want to give them an appropriate name. So let's just change this to Jorkus VPN. Now down the bottom we have an option here to use a smart card if we have those available. We could also allow other users that might use this computer to access this VPN connection as well. And we also have the option of not connecting now, just to set up this VPN connection and allow us to connect later. Well, I'm not going to select any of these. I'm going to click Next. And our final step here is to provide the credentials to authenticate us with the remote corporate network. So this would be our normal credentials we'd use when we log in at our desktop. So I'm just going to use the administrator account here, and we'll enter in a password. And you'll note we can also choose to show the characters of our password and remember that password as well, which is useful for not having to type it in each time, of course. And down the bottom here, we can enter in our domain name as well. All right, that's it. We're ready to go. So we can click Connect, and our VPN will be ready to rock. Well, it's sort of ready to go. Right now, if we actually try and use it, we will actually get an error message because there is still one more configuration option we need to do, but we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so we have our VPN connection created, but where do we find it? Well, in Windows Vista, we can come up here to connect to a network, and you'll see that listed here. Or we could choose Manage Network Connections, and we'll see our VPN listed there. And to run it, we'll simply double click on it. Now, obviously, it's going to try to connect again when I do this. So let's just click Connect, and you'll see that we do get an error here telling us that our connection was prevented due to a policy configured on our RAS server. So the problem actually has nothing to do with this machine. It's actually because the default behavior for our VPN is to not allow anyone in. So to fix this, we're going to need to head over to Active Directory, Users and Computers on our domain controller. Well, I've just quickly switched over to our domain controller here. So we're going to go and click on Start. We're going to fire up Active Directory, Users and Computers. We'll then need to come to the Users container. And since I'm trying to VPN in using the administrator account here, we're going to right click on the administrator account and choose Properties. Then we'll choose the Dial In tab. Now, right here at the top of this window here, this is the cause of us not being able to log into our VPN. It's currently set to control access through our network policy server. Well, this NPS network policy server is something we'll be talking about in later videos, so we're not going to get into that now. But right now, this is stopping us from getting in using our VPN. So we're going to set this to allow access. We'll click OK. And now we can go back to our Vista client machine and try that VPN once more. Right now, I've just switched back to Windows Vista here. Let's double click on this VPN again, and we'll hit Connect. Now this time our computer's being registered on the remote corporate network and we're in. So our VPN is now humming along nicely. We'd now be able to access corporate resources over the internet in a secure manner. And you'll also note that if we go and open up a command prompt here and we type in ipconfig, on Fig that is, you should see that we now have this new IP address assigned to us up here. There it is, 10.32.0.128, and this has been assigned to us by the remote access server. And by the way, if we switch over to our remote access server, we'll be able to see that this connection should be active there as well. So I've quickly just switched back to our remote access server, and if we go and click on ports, and let's click this status column here, just to sort this column out, we can see that our top one here is now listed as active. Now if we right click on this and choose status, there's our connection, which was authenticated by administrator, the administrator account there, and we can see the data that's coming into and out of this connection along with the IP address that's been assigned. Now do note that down the bottom here we can also choose to disconnect this user as well, something you might want to be aware of. Alright, so our VPN is obviously working, But before we wrap up this conversation about VPNs, let's switch back to our Vista client because there are some more options that you will want to become familiar with. Alright, so back on our Windows Vista machine, what we're going to do here is we're going to right click on our VPN connection and we're going to choose Status. Then we'll choose the Details tab here, or Details button rather. That's going to give us a little bit more information here about our network connection, our VPN network connection. You can see the IP address we've been assigned and so forth. Now let's go to our VPNs Details tab. And this is going to give us much of the same details there. Let's go through this. We can see that we are indeed obviously connected to a VPN using the point-to-point protocol. We're using Mschap version 2 using 128-bit encryption. We're not using compression or multi-link framing, and obviously we've been assigned this IP address, and we saw that a moment ago when we ran ipconfig. All right, well, let's click Close, and let's right-click again on our VPN and choose Properties. Now, I'm not going to run through all of the options here in all of these tabs because there are a lot of them, and most of them are pretty obvious in what they do. For example, here in our General tab, we can set the IP address of the server that we want to connect to. And the Options tab here, we've got redial options if we can't connect to our VPN and things like that. And these sorts of things are pretty obvious. So it'll be my preference here to stick with talking about the security and the networking tabs here, because these two tabs at least contain options that might not be clear to a lot of people. So on the security tab first, our default here is to require a password, and that password will be our Windows logon name and password. And we're also going to require our connection to be encrypted. Now, if we choose the Advanced Radio button here and then click Settings, we can then choose which protocols and encryption options that we'll agree to use from the client's perspective if the server doesn't support our preferred options. So the default at the top here is to require an encrypted session, and if the server we're trying to connect to doesn't support that encrypted session, then the default here is to simply disconnect the session. But we can change this to one of these other options if we like, even to the point here of not requiring encryption, which isn't a good idea for obvious reasons. Now, the other option we have here is to use EAP, or the Extensible Authentication Protocol, and this allows us to use multi-factor authentication requiring the use of a smart card or a certificate. Now, down the bottom of this window we can set what protocols we'll accept, and you can see that this does default to using Mschap version 2, but we can elect to use one of these more, well, we'll say insecure methods if we like. Alright, well, let's cancel this because these default values here are pretty much what we want to accept anyway, but on our networking tab we can set what type of VPN connection we want to use. Now, the default is to use automatic, so let Windows decide, or we can set this to a PPTP VPN, L2TP, or the Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol. Now, you guys might have heard of PPTP and L2TP before, but SSTP is something that's new in Windows 2008. And what makes SSTP different is that SSTP works over SSL, Secure Sockets Layer. And a lot of you guys listening would already know that SSL works over port 443. Now, in a lot of cases, the SSL port 443, is already open on your firewall, and that means that if you're able to use SSTP, it's likely that you won't have to do any configuration on your firewall at all. Now, the only real gotcha here is that in order to use SSTP, you will need to have a certificate, and since it's new, you're also going to have Windows 2008 as your remote access server, and your clients, your connecting clients, will need to be at least Windows Vista with Service Pack 1 or higher. So whilst SSTP is obviously a new option in Windows 2008, on the other hand, PPTP, that's been around for many, many years, before Windows 2000 in fact, and as evidenced by the fact that it's still in this list, it's obviously still in use today. Now, PPTP connections use MPPE, which is the Microsoft point-to-point encryption, and even though this is really old technology nowadays, it's still reliable and still secure. Now, our final option is L2TP, or the Layer 2 Tunneling Protocol, and this first came on the scene with Microsoft 2000, and it uses IPsec encryption, which is more advanced than the Microsoft point-to-point encryption that we'd use with PPTP. So these three here really run in order of good, better, and best, but the requirements get steeper as you move up the security level. So unless you've got all your ducks in a row and you're using the latest software, SSTP might be a little while down the track for many people. But if you do have Windows 2000 and Windows Vista Service Pack 1 or higher, great. Then certainly go ahead and use it. So in this video, we've talked about virtual private networking, or VPNs, on Windows Server 2008. They're incredibly easy to set up, as you've seen. So now you should be able to successfully install the network policy and access services role on a Windows 2008 server and configure the remote access service to start supporting these incoming VPN connections from our remote clients. Now, we also saw how we can configure the remote VPN connection on Windows Vista machines and how we can configure the various security and network options here as well. So we hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'd like to thank you for watching.